Yeah. Well, good morning, everybody. Glad you're here today. We're talking about the Sermon on the Mount, these revolutionary kingdom declarations. And I'll just go ahead and remind you that our theme slide here is a photo of an iceberg that kind of gives us an image, a idea of the teachings of Jesus. What is obvious on the surface, the iceberg tells us there's much more beneath the surface. And so we're trying to go a little bit beneath the surface here with Jesus' teachings and not just look at what he has to say on the surface, but try to dig a little bit deeper. Certainly that was Jesus' purpose too, as he is discussing the law. And we're going to get to that idea perhaps today where he's saying that your righteousness must surpass that of the Pharisees. So that is Jesus diving deep. And so we're going to be talking about that in just a moment. Just by way of review, let's just kind of zoom through these slides. I've got a bunch of them at this point now, but we've gone from the Beatitudes, the idea of those Macarisms. We refer to these blessings that Jesus pronounced upon the people. We tried to define that a little bit, and we're not going to go through all of these slides now, but just remember that the way that we use the word blessed is very different than the intention of Jesus in this discussion of the Beatitudes. We talked about some historical figures and their own Beatitudes as we got to this, but here we are in our idea of this. We had some class goals and objectives. I'm not going to review all of those, but remember that we began this study talking about the structure of Matthew, and the gospel itself is very well organized into 5 teaching blocks, and that the Sermon on the Mount is the first of those teaching blocks. The final one is found in the latter part of Matthew 23 especially. We talked about how that forms a wonderful bookend of Jesus' teaching, because here in this first teaching block, he pronounces the blessings. Matthew 23, he pronounces the woe unto you, scribes, Pharisees, hypocrites. And so there is an interesting symmetry there in the teaching of Jesus. The idea that Matthew introduces the Sermon on the Mount in these first chapters, talking about how Jesus is the fulfillment of prophecy, is going to become important again for our study today, or as we get into the theme of the Sermon on the Mount, where he says, I did not come to abolish, but to fulfill. So remember that word fulfill, and remember that we had a lot of things to talk about early in this Gospel of Matthew with Jesus in terms of him fulfilling prophecy. Matthew also presented Jesus as the new Moses, who goes to the mountain and who goes and he is bringing the law, bringing the covenant. The kingdom of heaven is also one of the major themes, and one of the most repetitive statements in the Gospel of Matthew. It appears nowhere else. So this is quite interesting. We talked about the background of the various philosophies of thought during the days of Jesus, and how that is very important to us understanding the Sermon on the Mount, and their understanding of what to expect as he is bringing in this new kingdom. And so then we got into the Beatitudes themselves. We talked about these in terms of the triads that as they are held together. And these first 3 of the Beatitudes, blessed are the poor, blessed are those that mourn, blessed are the gentle. We discussed this as a means of Jesus providing this surprise announcement of those who are going to be citizens of this new kingdom. And the fact that these would be the ones that would come into the kingdom would be a surprise not only to the ones who were listening that day, but to the religiously elite of that day. We talked about that second triad, those who hunger, those who are merciful, those who are pure in heart. And we talked about that in terms of these are people who probably were most at home ethically with the teachings of Jesus. These are the ones who have this internal conscience within them that is guiding their hearts in the way that Jesus finds it very important. But it does lead to this third triad, these peacemakers and the persecuted and the slandered. When you pursue that life ethic, there are some consequences. There are some difficulties that are going to occur in your life because of the choice to follow that. And that is going to transition us into this next section, which we're still in the introduction to the Sermon on the Mount. Yes, here.
Bruce, kind of mentioned in your last step, those three categories are your passive, you're getting stirred up, and then, okay, I've got to take an action, make a decision here. Yeah. Will I be the gentle person who doesn't escalate it? And what am I going to do? I can't just do nothing.
Yeah. So there is a call to action for sure in this. And so in our next section, we're really going to see Jesus do bring this as a call to action. You remind me of something very important there, Gary. I want you to notice a transition that happens with that very last beatitude in verse 11, when he said, "Blessed are you when men cast insults at you." Do you observe something different that's happening in comparison to this beatitude versus the 8 previous ones?
This one is coming from other people.
Okay.
The others are, blessed are the poor in spirit. It's coming from your direction.
Okay, so there is that difference. There's something else very unique about this beatitude. Yes, Paul?
There's a bit of a warning there.
Okay.
The
Yeah.
best is coming.
Yeah. It's a dangerous way to live. Understand the risk that you're taking. There's one more very, very significant thing there, and it's easy to overlook. Blessed are you. You. This is the first time he points his finger at his crowd and said, "Blessed are you." It's becoming personal now. Yeah, you're wondering if this involves you as citizens of the kingdom? Yes. This is for you. Those of you who are gathered here who are on the fringes of society and have no real promise of success in this life, blessed are you. And so when we transition now into the 3 metaphors, he continues with that use of that word when he says, "You are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world." And then he defines the city that's set on the hill. And so we're going to spend a little bit of time trying to unpack what that means. And I want you to just be thinking about that right now. I'm providing you that idea to get the wheels of your mind turning. What do these metaphors mean? So that's the question I'm going to ask you in just a few moments. Does it mean to be the salt? What does it mean to be the light? All right, so be thinking about that. We're going to be talking about that in just a moment. As we think about these metaphors and the transition that's taking place, it's important, I think, to understand that we are still in the introduction of the Sermon on the Mount here. This is the natural flow from the Beatitudes to this point. If you were just to read these verses, and let's read these verses, they seem like they're kind of misfit in the structure as we have described this before. But let's just read this together. Beginning in verse 13, "You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt has become tasteless, how will it be made salty again? It is good for nothing anymore except to be thrown out and trampled under the foot by men. You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor do men light a lamp and put it under a peck measure, but on the lampstand, and it gives light to all who are in the house. Let your light shine before men in such a way that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. All right, so you tell me. You are the salt. What does that mean? Obviously, he's speaking metaphorically here, but you are the salt.
I think it means to be useful in God's kingdom.
Useful, because salt is useful.
It was back then.
Was back then.
Yeah, to preserve
And it's,
foods.
Preserves food.
yeah, and I always heard the preserves food thing.
Uh-huh.
There's another thing of as a Floridian and an athlete. Salt. If you don't have enough salt, you stand up, whoa, you're gonna get dizzy and fall down.
Mhm.
You are not going to have actual strength, even with something as seemingly innocuous as salt. It's absolutely.
It's an electrolyte
crucial.
that is absolutely necessary. Yeah, Gary.
When the salt is in you, it brings life, but when you pour it on the soil, it kills life.
Interesting.
Try it on the plants.
Interesting.
Yeah,
Huh?
the ones you don't want.
Yeah, Gintis?
Yeah.
Well, he says it's lost its taste, so I think he's talking about the effect on taste. It makes sense.
Ah, the effect of taste and flavor. Wow. So many things come up when you talk about salt. So what's the definitive answer?
Yes.
Yeah.
Squeeze it.
All right. Speaking as an athlete, speaking as a physiologist, speaking in so many ways, speaking as just an observer of the world. Let's talk about the chemistry just for a minute.
Oh,
fancy.
Oh.
Chris, you raised your hand.
I'm just going to say that this would be a great synopsis of what the gospel was all about. The world is doomed. The world is dark. The world is tasteless. The world is, falling apart. And God's remedy to all that in these examples is just as effective and useful and beneficial and preserving as these things are. That's what you're supposed to be.
Yeah.
So it's very compact and punch you in the face. That's what we're supposed to be.
Interesting. Yeah, very good. Lots of ideas. That's the point. There's lots of ideas, but it's hard to really single in on exactly what is Jesus saying here. And I'll just point this out that sodium chloride, one of the most abundant compounds on Earth, it's made up of the metal sodium and chlorine in its natural room temperature state is a gas. If by electrolysis you were to break this ionic bond between sodium and chloride, you would end up with this yellow metal that is quite reactive. In fact, it's explosive. You put sodium in water and it explodes. This enormous exothermic reaction occurs when you put sodium in water. And chlorine gas in its state is deadly. It is mustard gas that was used in World War I. And so it's this terribly toxic element that is deadly. So is it possible that Jesus is saying if the salt loses its saltiness, you become dangerously explosive and toxic? I don't think Jesus was really looking at the periodic table when he said this. But that's an idea, right? There's another idea there about what he could possibly mean here.
And we can,
That's-
we can observe that.
Oh, we certainly can observe that. There's something happens when we lose our saltiness, yes.
Can salt lose its taste? Can it lose its, I've never heard of somebody pouring salt on something and be like, it didn't work this time. But does that mean if you are salt, it's impossible for you to lose your...
The only way that I know of for salt to lose its saltiness is to divide it into its component parts. And that's the point that I'm illustrating here. That requires a lot of energy and electrolysis and a lot of heat. But that's again, I don't think Jesus is really giving us a chemistry lesson here. Yeah, Bonnie.
It seems to me like Jesus is pointing out the necessity of salt. and its usefulness versus its lack of use.
All right.
Less.
Let's try to simplify things. I always go to the simple. That's how my mind works. Salt is presented as a metaphor here in parallel unison with light, right? Can we see that what is true about what Jesus says about salt, you are the salt, is true about what he says about light? Is that obvious from just reading the text from its surface? Salt alone, as a metaphor, standing alone, is difficult because there's so many applications that we could make to that. The metaphors are very evocative, and there's lots of things that we can say about the interpretation of it. But when these two metaphors overlap conceptually, there's an idea that biblically comes out, and I'm going to try to illustrate that in a moment. But when put into parallel conjunction with light, I think it becomes much more clear. So you are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. Isn't he saying the same thing? Earth and world? I think so. I think he's making parallel statements here. He says, you are this. You are the salt. You are the light in both of these things. He talks about salt becoming good for nothing, which implies that it is good for something, right? Salt is good. It is useful. It has a good purpose. Light, what does he say about the light? Light is like good works, right? So there's an obvious parallelism going on here. And so we need to be salty, not the way we use the word today, but we need to have that good effect, and we need to be lit. Again, not the way we use that word today, but we need to be lighted. We need to exude light. Salty and lit doesn't really seem to describe a Christian, does it? But that is what Jesus is saying. We need to have those kinds of qualities. Those are the metaphors. So let Jesus define what it means to be salty. And what the conclusion he comes to, I think he explains in verse 16, when he explains what the light metaphor is. Let your light shine before men in such a way that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. So being salty and being lit then is participating in good works, otherwise known as righteousness. We keep coming back to that, and we're going to delve deep into that very shortly. And that results in glorifying the Father. All right? So that's my very simple, simplistic explanation for what these metaphors are. Now, let's go a little bit deeper. Yes, Gary.
There is a small but not insignificant difference between the earth and the world. The earth is just what I stand on. The world includes my atmosphere.
Sure,
And
absolutely.
in the same way, the light is all around. I mean, it is a part of your life. It's not just the salt, not just what I need to live. It is my life.
Very good.
To further that point, you draw salt from the earth, but light was brought to the world.
Oh, perfect.
Ooh. Mic drop.
Right. I like it. I like it. All
And
right.
Bruce, I just had one other thing.
All right.
When Jesus says about salt, but if salt has lost its taste, how can the saltiness be restored? I've never heard of salt losing saltiness. Okay,
Right.
And so maybe his point is
You can't.
you don't get out of this. You know, you are salt, and you need to embrace the fact that you are salt. Don't pretend you ain't salt.
All right. So that gets us to a major point that I think he's making theologically. And that is, and it's already been said, that salt in this day was a preservative. It was very much necessary to have something that would preserve food for the people, so that that food would last, so that it would endure. There is a sense of a long-lasting endurance that is associated with salt. And this is found biblically as well. And so what we're going to discover is that salt is symbolic of the everlasting, enduring covenant of God. And I'm not just making this up, all right? I'm not just making this up, because there are several scriptures that give us insight into this, like Numbers, the 18th chapter, and verse 19. All of the offerings and holy gifts which the sons of Israel offer to the Lord, I have given to you and your sons and your daughters with you as a perpetual allotment. It is an everlasting covenant of salt. An everlasting covenant of salt before the Lord and your descendants with you. Even back in this day, salt was connected to the covenant to describe its enduring quality, its permanence. 2 Chronicles 13, verse 5. Do you not know that the Lord God of Israel gave you ruler over Israel forever to David and his sons by a covenant of salt? To these people, salt was something that made things last, and it gave this quality of permanence to that. And that was such an important element of their understanding that God said, when you give your offerings, be sure to include salt. Salt your offerings, he says. Salt, every grain offering of yours, moreover, you shall season with salt, so that the salt of the covenant of your God shall not be lacking from your grain offering. With all your offerings, you shall offer salt. And so when they offered their offerings with salt, it was a reminder to them that this was preserving, this was enduring, this was long-lasting, and it was related to the covenant. And so when Jesus says, you are the salt of the earth, he is including them in this grand covenant that he is revealing to them. And if you just go down a couple of verses, he says in verse 18, for truly I say to you, unless heaven and earth pass away, not the smallest letter or stroke shall pass away from the law until all is accomplished. You see the enduring nature of the law? That's the point that he's making with salt, I believe, here. Think enduring covenant. Enduring covenant when he says salt. Jesus is unveiling the covenant that God made with Abraham, that he is, it's not right to say he's building upon it, but there's a sense in which he is. This is a living, breathing covenant that continues through the ministry of Jesus until he goes to the cross and seals that covenant with his blood. You are the salt. You are a participant in this enduring covenant that we're going to be learning more about. But he also says, you are the light. You are the light. And we have to give a nod here to the prophet Isaiah, because this is a theme, a major theme in Isaiah. The storyline of Isaiah is that God is going to bring forth his light, and it's going to shine brightly in the world. This is all messianic prophecy, and that it will be like a city on a hill that will be visible to all of the nations. So the implication is that this light is for the Gentiles also. And as far back as Isaiah Isaiah is making this prophecy. And so we can read in different places, different, as I just cherry pick a few of the verses from Isaiah, God talks about his servant. And this is a messianic prophecy. Behold my servant whom I uphold, my chosen one in whom my soul delights. I've put my spirit upon him. He will bring forth justice to the nations. So this is a very widespread concept. Later on in this same chapter, I am the Lord. I have called you in righteousness. I will also hold you by the hand and watch over you. I will appoint you as a covenant to the people, as a light to the nations, to open blind eyes, to bring out prisoners from dungeon, and those who dwell in darkness from prison. You remember this? This was even a text that Jesus read in the synagogue one day. And he's bringing that out and he's saying, that is me. And as Isaiah has this as one of the great storylines, I am bringing my light into the world, and the world and all of the nations will benefit by this. In Isaiah 49, verses 5 and 6, and then in verse 8, now we have the servant himself speaking. And now says the Lord who formed me from the womb to be his servant, to bring Jacob back to him so that Israel might be gathered to him. For I am honored in the sight of the Lord, and my God is my strength. He says, is it too small a thing that you should be my servant to raise up tribes of Jacob and to restore the preserved ones of Israel? I will also make you a light of the nations, so that my salvation may reach to the end of the earth. I have to laugh. I have to laugh when I read that every time. My salvation. That is the Hebrew word Yeshua. My salvation, which is the Hebrew equivalent of Jesus. Isn't that cool? That's cool. My salvation may reach to the end of the earth. Thus says the Lord, in a favorable time I have answered you, and in the day of salvation I have helped you, and will keep you and give you for a covenant to the people, to restore the land, to make them inherit the desolate heritages. So here he's making these prophecies about shining his light into the world and how this is going to all unfold. And then we go over to Isaiah 60. And he says this, arise, shine, for your light has come. The glory of the Lord has risen upon you. For behold, darkness will cover the earth, deep darkness of the people, but the Lord will rise upon you, and his glory will appear upon you. Nations will come to your light, and kings to the brightness of your rising. The sons of those who afflicted you will come bowing to you, and all those who despise you will bow themselves at the sole of your feet, and they will call you the city of the Lord, the Zion of the Holy One of Israel. That's where that idea of the city set on a hill comes in. I firmly believe Jesus had Isaiah in his mind when he said this, when he said, you are the light. It is way too much of a coincidence of metaphors that Isaiah could present this in this way. Jesus would quote regularly from Isaiah. Even in chapter 4, you remember one of those prophecies? In verse 14, he says, I'm back in Matthew now. Matthew 4, verse 14, this was to fulfill what was spoken through Isaiah the prophet, saying, the land of Zebulun, the land of Naphtali, by the way of the sea, beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles, the people who were sitting in darkness saw a great light. And to those who were sitting in the land, a shadow upon death, upon them a light dawned. That concept in Isaiah, Jesus is describing the fulfillment of that not only in himself, but among his disciples. You are the salt, and you are the light. And so when Jesus begins sending his disciples out, they become his spokesmen, and they say the things that he says. They shed the light of the gospel to the world. They shine and they perform good works. You are the light. You are the salt. And so that whole storyline of Isaiah being a light of the world and a city set on a hill finds its fulfillment here in these metaphors that Jesus gives. And so we come to the conclusion of the introduction of the Sermon on the Mount. The conclusion that here highlights the need for us to be real people living in the real world and to have an active behavioral response to this message of Jesus, to be connected to Jesus in a very special way. As he is the light of the world, we become the light of the world. And that requires a change of our behavior, but not just our outward behavior. Jesus is not concerned about outward behavior. In fact, he will expose the Pharisees for their outward behavior and their inward corruption. And that's the transition to the next section. Unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. And that's what this is all about. Defining the citizens of the kingdom of heaven. So he's calling upon us to live in this world and demonstrate a shared identity with Jesus as salt and light and a city on a hill that is remarkable for its brightness, shining light upon all of the Gentiles, all of the nations. Oh, I'm going to pause to give you a moment to share your thoughts. Yes, Gary.
It's quite possible all these people had experienced the festival of light at Jerusalem at some time in their life too. And they had that feeling, that presence of what this really is like.
Yeah. Sure. The Festival of Lights would, that whole concept of light is a metaphor that we could have done the same thing. I could have said, what does the light mean? Well, God spoke and he created light. God has brought his light to the world. God, let there be light. God has given us the law, which enlightens our path. On and on and on. We can go with all of those metaphors as well, and it's all inclusive, I believe, in that concept of light, for sure. What else you have for me before we're done today?
I just wanted to, go ahead.
I was thinking too, like, as poor Jews under Roman rule, right?
Mm-hmm.
They would have been persecuted anyways.
Yeah.
But now you would be persecuted, but with a hope.
Yeah.
And that'd be different. That would change your view of
Changes
persecution,
everything,
yeah.
right? Yeah, absolutely. Great point. Gotcha.
I was just saying, I mentioned this to you, I think, after class last week. If you understand what righteousness really means, it is not difficult to surpass the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, because their quote unquote righteousness was only on the outside.
Yeah.
And true righteousness is not just about the outside. Yeah, you're going to see stuff on the outside, but that's not where the righteousness dwells. It comes from, why are you doing these things? How are you doing these?
However, these words are revolutionary because the Pharisees were held in such esteem as these are the holiest, most righteous.
And they told everybody
most
they were
pious.
the most righteous. So,
And they believed it.
Yeah.
And they believed it. And so when Jesus drops this bomb,
Yeah.
that is an attention grabber. And so that's when we get into this next section, when he talks about the fulfillment of the law. I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you'll not enter the kingdom of
I
heaven.
think it could be harder than
than just expressing that, because if the devil knows that's what we need to do, so he can convince us that our righteousness is where it needs to be. And yet
Let me
it's
show
not.
you my righteousness.
And yet it's not, because we do look at that outside so much, even today.
And so we will consider that in light of our metaphor, the iceberg. And that's what this next section will dramatically present for us as we think about what it means to not commit murder. It's more than just not killing people. I hate to I hate to ruin it for you, but it's more than that. And what it means to not commit adultery, it's more than a physical action. There's more to it than that. We've got to go under the water and see what Jesus. And so now Jesus does something that's brilliant. He does something that all great teachers do. He doesn't just tell us the information. He illustrates it. He illustrates it and brings it to life by saying, "You have heard that it has been said, but I say unto you," which is a dramatic statement, very provocative statement itself, one that rabbis of his day could get themselves killed over. And then he starts giving us these case studies. And so that is where we're headed. And so be thinking about that as we get into our next section. I think the bunch are most great.
No doubt.
Nice try. Nice try.
Thank you.
Steve wants you to fix the bell.